Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? There are a lot of people who want to have their voices be heard, but for the longest time, it was really difficult for the average person to get their message across to a wide audience. Clearly, the internet has changed all of that, but not entirely for the better. So this is a huge topic to try to unpack. I've got a ton of notes in front of me, and I'm going to do the best I can, but there are plenty of other arguments and opinions to be had about this. So clearly this is just going to be kind of one facet of this entire topic, and I encourage you to seek out other information and opinions on this thing as well. Basically, there have always been people with ideas or stories that they want to share with others, whether that's news or their opinion on politics, trying to drum up business for themselves, or even just wishing to provide entertainment to others. Maybe they're musicians or artists or something like that. Everyone, seemingly a lot of people, have something that they want to share with others. And over time, there have been new formats or media that have come out, but for the average person, there's always been some sort of barrier to entry when it comes to reaching a wide audience. It could be something like access to equipment or facilities. It could also be simple things like time or geography. If you look at something like printed materials, well, printing and distributing those can be costly. You need to come up with the design. You need to, get that to a printing press. It costs money to actually get that stuff created and to spread it widely. It costs a lot of money to print a newspaper or to write a book and distribute it, print a magazine, that sort of thing. So even when printed materials were one of, if not the most popular ways to get information out there, it still had a bit of a barrier to entry. I mean, anyone could print up a small little news flyer, but if you really wanted to spread your message wide, that had a cost to it. And few people also had direct access to some of that equipment to try and bring the cost down. If you look at things like broadcasting, that's very prohibitive to get into on your own, things like radio and TV. So even if you could land a spot on a radio show, for example, you would still be limited by, say, the broadcast range of that radio station, and then also the fact that it was a one-time event. It wasn't perpetual. No one could later go on and easily find what you had said, easily search for it, retrieve it, and listen to it whenever they wanted. With things like radio and TV, back when they were, predominant ways of disseminating information, they were very linear and very one-time. So it was tough for independent opinions, independent people to be able to get those voices heard across that medium, to share whatever it is that they wanted to share. So in order to get one's message spread wider with those traditional forms of media, you had to work with the media companies. And of course, they ended up acting like gatekeepers. But very few people who went down that path would succeed, relatively. And those that did succeed generally have a message that's financially beneficial to that media company, right? Yes, there is such form of public broadcasting and community media and that sort of thing, but that's very limited in scope. If you wanted to get a radio program where you talked about certain topics that you were passionate about, or you wanted to come up with a TV show where you explored certain things or played your music on the radio or whatever, in general, you had to be one of the lucky few that the media company found engaging enough for its audience to be willing to put effectively on the air. So it was very limited and commercialized and just kind of lowest common denominator. I mean, you have to look at the business model of those media companies, right? there certainly was dissenting content that was spread widely, but it seems like the majority of what was being broadcast and sent out to large groups of people, maybe nationwide or worldwide, was fairly toned down compared to what we're seeing today, partially because of that business model. I mean, you think about how relatively few large commercial media outlets there were. And we're talking traditional media, so things like print and TV and radio. They were all competing for the same viewers and readers and listeners. And so going too far off the deep end was a threat to their business. They needed to get as many people as they could to pay attention to their company and what it was putting out so that they could sell advertising effectively. And so by alienating their audience too much, by straying in one direction or the other too far, could mean a loss of viewership or readership, which results in fewer advertising dollars. So it seemed like opinions and everything across the mass media was fairly tempered. You wouldn't see just kind of the crazy stuff like what we see on the internet today. But of course, now we have the internet, and it didn't change things overnight, I don't think, but it did kick off this dramatic shift in how people got their message across and who was actually getting their message across to really everywhere. I mean, it eliminated most of those hurdles that traditional media faced. Getting web hosting was fairly inexpensive, if not free. Even in the 90s, with the internet being very early and new, if you had access to the internet, let's say you signed up with your internet service provider, even for something like dial-up, it was very common for them to give you two things. An email account, which not very many people actually use their ISP's email system anymore, but back then, that was predominantly how people got email. And then two, a lot of them offered you some amount of web hosting because, well, it wasn't very expensive for them to do. It was a simple little value add, and it helped promote their own business model, for internet service providers, of actually getting content out on the internet that people would want to go find. And the more people that wanted to find content on the internet would turn into more, subscriptions to internet service access, AOL, CompuServe, or the independent ISPs that you'd have, maybe locally to you. And so it was kind of self-perpetuating. So getting that web hosting, just getting a platform for the average person was fairly easy. It was often just handed to them. Here's some space. Here's your own little corner of the internet where you can do and say generally what you want. The content was also posted and remained there forever. If you think of like the earliest web content that individual people would come up, it was effectively things like blogs. Well, they didn't have that term necessarily back then, but like a personal website where you would just talk about whatever it is that you wanted to focus on, right? Maybe you had certain passions on hobbies, or talking about knowledge that you've got. Maybe you're experienced in a certain professional topic and you wanted to educate others on it. That sort of thing, it stayed there. It wasn't a one-time event where you went on the radio show or the TV show or got that letter to the editor printed in the newspaper that one day. You posted it and it was just up there, and anyone at any time could go and find it. You also got around a lot of those geographic restrictions. Like I said, with the TV and the radio and the newspaper, those are fairly regional, limited in terms of scope. I mean, if you're on a radio station in New York, people in Los Angeles aren't going to be able to hear it because of the simple fact that you can't broadcast that far. And yeah, you can make the argument that, maybe you could get on some sort of national radio or TV program. But again, we get back into that whole kind of, limited gatekeeper type of thing. The bigger of a broadcast platform that you want to get on, the harder it is for you to get into it because, they have to go with the most popular kind of content, the bigger a scale you want to get. So you got around those geographic restrictions by being on the internet. Suddenly everyone around the world can find what you want to say and read it and respond to you because of the whole email thing, and then eventually web comments and all that stuff that came afterwards. And then the big thing that radio and TV and newspapers, magazines, other traditional forms of media never really had easy access to was the advent of the search engine. The fact that you've got a place on the internet that you can use to easily find other places on the internet was a game changer in that regard. I mean, yeah, you could go to the library and maybe find, some listings of some topics that were in the newspaper, but it was a fairly arduous process. A good example is when I've gone and done some work on things like the retrospective pieces that I've done. I've occasionally had to go back to printed material in order to be able to do that. And sometimes that information's on the internet, which makes it really easy to find, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes I just get little bits and pieces of it, maybe a reference to a newspaper article from years ago or a magazine article or something like that. It can become kind of arduous to go and find that information like in real life, in person, having to go and find a copy of that magazine or go to the library and dig through the microfiche and, find that page and get an image of it, that sort of thing. That's the way it was with traditional media for a very long time. So it makes a lot of sense that people would be living fairly in the moment at that time where they would just see what was the new thing that came out that day. And relatively few people would try to actually seek out information that had been published previously. With the internet and search engines, suddenly it's there perpetually, potentially. So it made a huge impact on the way we communicate with each other and get our opinions and everything out there. The only real hurdles in, say, the 90s with the birth of the internet and actual end users, consumers getting online was simply two things. One, just owning a computer, and then two, knowing how to build a site. And of course, those hurdles started disappearing as time went on. Computer ownership became more common, internet access became more common, and then even getting around the knowledge angle of building a site and getting your information out there, that started to become less and less of an issue because of things like WYSIWYG web design programs. What you see is what you get, where instead of having to know something like HTML, you would simply get a program on your computer where you could treat it almost like it's Microsoft Word. You just type in what you want, and you can drag elements around the page, build the site, and it just does all that coding for you. And then also online site building services where those things started to just be built on the platform that you would eventually publish. WordPress is a great example where you don't really need to know code in order to build a site anymore. The tools do all of that for you. All you have to do is supply it with the content. Now, that was great. And it really kicked off this major change in how we think about getting information and seeking out new knowledge. But the real revolution was with social media. And that revolution happened much, much quicker. That's really the big thing that a lot of people have been talking about increasingly as time has gone on, and its impacts on society and how we get our news and how we get our information, and even to what we believe. The existence of platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and all the others, well, it's dramatically different. It's not just to provide a place to host that kind of stuff. They're not just another web hosting type of facility. They've got a completely different modus operandi, and that is they are meant to encourage people to create and share content, not just to provide that place, but rather their entire business model is based around getting people to engage with each other. Because it works regardless of what the content is. It's a much larger scale. They're going off of volume. Unlike with traditional media, TV and radio and all those others, where they can't really afford to risk pissing off large groups of people with their content. Sometimes they still do, of course, but that's generally not the intention. I mean, you look at like a broadcast TV network, they're going to generally play it fairly safe in terms of what content that they put out on the air. With large social media platforms, they don't really care because they've got millions, if not billions of people using them. They understand that there's going to be a huge, wide swath of differing opinions and topics being talked about. And so they're just going off of volume. The more people that they can get with their eyeballs on that platform, the more revenue they can generate. And you know what? On its face, it's an absolutely awesome thing because suddenly it allows for a much wider range of content to be made and found. It can connect people that have fairly niche interests, right? Like you look at a channel like mine here on YouTube or my podcast for the Patreon supporters, if you're just listening, there is absolutely no way that my content would have ever made it on a TV program or a radio show. What I cover, what I talk about simply isn't mainstream enough. And that goes for many, many other YouTubers and many, many other content creators, whether they're doing it professionally full-time or not, like me. So it's really encouraged this thing that I've kind of considered the democratization of media. It lets people decide what they want to consume and what they want to create instead of having to simply settle for what traditional media companies want to offer them, what they feel is something safe that the majority of people would find interesting. So, YouTube, a fantastic example of that. Instagram is actually another great example of that. And even some other platforms you may not necessarily consider social media, but actually are, like SoundCloud. There have been lots of musicians that have gotten discovered because of work that they've just published to their own SoundCloud accounts and, other similar music sharing kind of platforms like that. And it lets existing musicians connect with their fans in new ways. There are some really big name musicians that will just occasionally drop a new song that they had been working on, on a platform like that. Here, I've been noodling around with this idea. Here's a new track. Let me know what you think. That sort of thing. So it can connect people much more directly than with a traditional media company acting as kind of like a middleman. You're no longer at arm's reach with that creator or that artist or that journalist or whoever. You're suddenly right there with them and can engage much more directly and seek out the very specific knowledge that you're looking for, because now there are suddenly many other people out there just like you. You no longer feel like you're the only person who has some of the interests that you have. When I started publishing videos to YouTube, God, what was it, 4 years ago now? Over 4 years ago? Sometimes I felt like I was the only person that was interested in some of the topics that I covered. Well, it turns out there are plenty of other people who have similar interests to mine, and we can all learn from each other. And it's fantastic. Unfortunately, it's not all perfect. As exists in life, there are pros and cons generally to everything. And dealing with these imperfect aspects to the internet and to communication is a lot of what we've been facing lately, what we've been struggling with. While it's really easy for those with genuine intentions to get their message out, the barrier to entry is almost gone at this point because the platforms are free to use. The technology is the kind of technology most people have. I mean, there are people who have run entire YouTube channels simply with a smartphone, filming everything on a smartphone, editing, uploading to YouTube, or taking pictures for Instagram entirely on a smartphone, posting them, gaining a good following, that sort of thing. the barrier is very low, but that same is also true for those with, let's say, nefarious agendas. It all hinges around the concept, I feel, of people being less skeptical of other individuals versus companies or organizations. I mean, we tend to believe, I think, that individuals are going to be more honest. We've kind of been trained to think that a company or an organization is going to have some sort of ulterior motive or agenda, nefarious or not, but we tend to think of those companies as having, an angle to them. And so we take their message with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? A lot of times we look at, say a tweet from a company that may be promoting a thing. Well, you realize, yeah, okay, they're promoting it, but there's a business angle to it too, right? I mean, and maybe it's even for really good purposes. Maybe it's a company that's expressing support for some charitable organization. But at the same time, we all in the back of our minds realize these companies wouldn't be expressing that support if it didn't also lead to some additional business benefit for them. Either it helps them connect to potential customers better, it helps them connect with existing customers better, or it just gets their name out there, get a little bit more name recognition, right? It makes people kind of associate parts of their life with certain brands and could lead to more sales. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something we all tend to think about. Whereas if a regular individual, the average Joe, or seemingly the average Joe on the internet says, hey, I just donated some money to this charitable organization because I think they do good work, we're less inclined to believe that they've got some other ulterior motive or agenda going on. We're more inclined to think that, oh, they're just a good person. They're trying to, spread this good information out there, and we tend to take it more at face value from who we see online as just other individuals like ourselves as opposed to companies. So in a way, we have more sway over other people as individual voices than the mass media does. And you think about things like grassroots efforts and crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, there's a lot of power to individual people kind of spreading their messages and getting other people on board versus just an organization or a company or a media outlet trying to do the same thing. Not to say that those companies and orgs aren't successful when they do it, but there is generally going to be, I would argue, a bit less skepticism over when it's a grassroots type of thing, when it's just other average people who believe in a cause and are trying to trumpet whatever that cause is. So it gets a bit scary when you think about that because, yeah, it can seem genuine, but increasingly, as time has gone on, we've found that a lot of times it's not. It's not genuine. Those people that are acting like normal individuals aren't necessarily normal individuals. Sometimes the people that we interact with on social media aren't even real people, or at least, who we see information coming from. I don't want to get political, but at this point in time, as I'm filming this, it's generally been confirmed or accepted by a lot of people, not everyone, and I've got to speak in very general terms because otherwise I'm going to get murdered down in the comments. Wait, who am I kidding? I'm going to get murdered down in the comments anyway. Because, again, this is the internet. Boy, this ties into this topic really well, doesn't it? It's generally been accepted by a lot of people that social media was used by a foreign government to influence the outcome of the last U.S. presidential election. I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not going to make any more statements about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing or who was right, who was wrong, anything like that. But let's just say we have a generally well-accepted, wide-reaching example of social media being used for bad purposes that actually affect people. It wasn't an obvious propaganda campaign. In the past, if it was 30 years ago, it would have been much more obvious as to who was behind the actions that went on. But rather, this time around, it was just a whole bunch of fake accounts that looked like real people. And it was very well crafted to seed information out there to get people thinking about it and believing that information to have an effect on their opinions and thus their actions, what effectively, ended up being the way it was. Whether it was 100% successful or not, that remains to be seen because of the nebulous nature of the internet. We can't quantify, okay, well, the actions of this campaign by this foreign government affected, exactly this number of US voters to change their opinion or their mind or whatever. It's really hard to do that, but it's generally been accepted that there has been some impact. And it gets even more scary when the dissemination of news is concerned. Not even in terms of trying to sway opinion for a singular event like a country's vote, but just everyday life. A decent number of people have been trained to think that journalism has become biased. And as a bit of a side note, in a way, I think journalism kind of is biased, but not how you might think. Some people like to call modern journalism the liberal media, in quotation marks, in a derogatory way to express a political slant. But I think that journalism in some ways has to be liberal, but not in terms of stance on social issues, but rather ideology. Here's the way I like to think of this. Which would you rather trust? A well-written news article about a topic that the reporter dug deep to get to the truth, that they interviewed multiple people, did lots of independent research, questioned what they were being told by their sources to really try and give the reader a full picture of actually what's going on, versus an article where someone simply took a statement from a source at face value and repeated it. And just said, this is what this person told me, therefore it must be true. In some ways, that digging deep, that questioning authority, that questioning what you're being told and doing that additional research, yeah, that's some liberal ideology in terms of being open-minded and actually trying to unpack the world around you and not just looking at what's being presented to you and accepting it. I tend to think that in some ways, yes, the media does need to be liberal in quotes in that way, but because of the way a lot of that's been portrayed to the general public, it's gotten people to think of the media as being liberal in that more kind of political or social issues type of stance. Not to say that there aren't, media outlets that have those sorts of leanings, but there are also media outlets that have fairly conservative views and everything like that. And talking about modern media and everything is definitely a topic for another podcast because, that's a huge thing to unpack in and of itself. But in general, I feel like people have been trained consciously or subconsciously to maybe think that modern professional journalism isn't as objective as it should be. And when you start throwing the concept of fake news into the mix, it can become a real concern because if people are skeptical of existing news outlets and professional journalists, then how are they supposed to differentiate between that and fake news, right? They don't know how to spot this misinformation that intentionally gets disseminated for ulterior motives. I mean, when the internet is a free-for-all, how are you supposed to know what's trustworthy or not? To kind of go on an extension of that, the internet also makes it much easier to simply promote unpopular opinions and ideologies. It helps keep alive harmful ideas, ones that may violate societal norms or otherwise promote disenfranchising groups of people, whatever those groups of people are. However you want to try and, label and classify people, there are generally going to be some people out on the internet that have a problem with those people, whatever that, that slice of people actually are. And so that large platform that is the internet, that is social media in particular, it can bring people with those similar ideas together and in some ways gives them credence, often undeservedly. And it's really kind of coming down to the true meaning of the so-called vocal minority. The internet is so big, it's hard to judge scale. You can't really wrap your head around it, right? Because the internet is in some ways every human on planet Earth. Granted, not everyone on planet Earth has access to the internet, but there's a good chance that someday almost everyone will. And so when you see a few people talking about a topic, whatever that topic is, you might be inclined to think that it's more popular than it actually is, simply because you can't really compare it against the whole, because you can't define what the whole is. It's like when you think about the planet Earth in regards to the universe. It's mind-boggling just how tiny our planet is compared to the galaxy, compared to the rest of the universe. And it's actually really hard for us to fully understand how tiny our planet is because we're incapable of seeing the big picture. We don't know how big the universe is. We don't know if there's only one universe or more. It's out of our grasp. And in some ways, the internet's the same thing. So it's really hard to tell that scale. So we tend to kind of let our minds run away with ourselves. And, maybe if we see a few people talking about a particular topic, we may think, well, if there's a few people talking about it online, there's probably quite a bit more out there talking about it too, because, well, the internet's big and I can only see a portion of it at a time. So this must be a much bigger thing than I think. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe you just happen to stumble across the largest, in quotes, group of people who are talking about that topic, regardless of what that topic was. And you may then falsely assume that it's a more prevalent opinion or topic than it actually is. So how do we deal with this kind of content, especially harmful content? Well, the first thing is, how do you even define harmful content? Platforms like social media generally have user agreements that prohibit discriminatory behavior, various things. But lots of what people gets riled up tends to exist in a gray area. Things that are unpopular, but not egregious. There's plenty of egregious stuff out on the internet too that people are trying to promote. But there's a lot of what I feel really gets people worked up is stuff that's generally unacceptable to various groups of people. And again, I'm trying to speak in fairly generic terms here for somewhat obvious reasons. But it all tends to exist in that gray area where, yeah, it's not against the rules to talk about it, but it's in bad taste. Let's just say that. So some people believe that the U.S. First Amendment can be used to protect those who are promoting harm, right? And especially amongst the people who are trying to promote harm, however you want to define that. I generally tend to kind of go against that concept of people who are wanting to violate societal norms or otherwise promoting that kind of disenfranchising type of behavior. A lot of times people who have dissenting opinions like that, the vocal minority, will use the First Amendment as a shield to justify their behavior. Oh, well, I live in the U.S. and free country, right? Free speech. People love to tout that. Well, here's the thing. Aside from a few well-defined exceptions, the First Amendment isn't actually going to grant privileges to U.S. citizens. It's not a thing that is given to U.S. citizens to use as an excuse. But rather, the First Amendment is actually more a set of limitations placed on the U.S. government. You've got to think about back when the First Amendment was drafted. There was real conscious risk from the general public's part of the government kind of taking over and dictating their lives. I mean, you look at like the American Revolution. Why do you think people went through the American Revolution? Because they were tired of being, I don't want to say oppressed, but overly controlled by the English government. They wanted to rule themselves. They wanted to come up with their own terms, and they wanted to have more freedom. The First Amendment is basically there to prevent the U.S. government from going after you if you have something bad to say about it. If you want to criticize the U.S. government, and this is true of a lot of other free speech type of laws in other countries and nations, it's generally to protect the people from the government and not necessarily give the people a free pass to do or say whatever they want. Like I said, there were definitely some exceptions to it, which, again, worthy of another podcast topic because those go pretty deep and they're generally more rooted in case law than they are in like written doctrine or anything like that. But the other thing that everyone tends to forget is that the First Amendment doesn't apply to non-public spaces. You could go over to somebody else's house and you could start trash talking them. Hey, I know you like Super Nintendo, but you know what? I like Sega Genesis and you suck for liking Super Nintendo. You could do that. And they could kick you out of their house. They could say, you know what? I don't like that. I don't like what you're saying. This is my private property. I want you to leave. And they would be fully within their right to do that because that's not something that the First Amendment protects. And people fail to connect that to the internet. Yeah, the internet is this big free-for-all, but when you're using somebody else's platform, you have to abide by their rules. You're effectively in their house. And so it doesn't let you go on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or wherever and just spout off whatever you want and say, oh, well, you know what? I'm a U.S. citizen and I've got the First Amendment to protect me. No. You have to follow the rules of the platform. Now, here's the challenge. Social media has generally really sucked at policing users who are engaging in egregious behavior or ones that otherwise violate the terms and conditions that they agreed to when they signed up for the service. And they suck at it really, as far as I can tell, for two reasons. First, because of the scale. I mean, you look at how many people use Twitter, there's a lot. You look at how many people use Facebook, there's a mind-boggling number of people using Facebook. There's just no way for human moderators to keep up with the amount of content that's being generated. There's no way that they could hire enough people to really keep up with that in real time or even close to real time to clean a lot of that up. A lot of times these platforms have started to depend on AI and machine learning. Well, that's far from perfect. Great example is YouTube and the whole adpocalypse thing, right? A lot of content creators, including myself, started getting videos flagged by the content moderation system that YouTube put into place to try to cut down on a lot of the, let's just say, unsavory content that was getting pushed on the platform. Well, the problem is they couldn't hire enough people to do it manually. So they relied on technology to do it, and that technology is far from perfect. For a long stretch there, for many months, every single video I uploaded got flagged as being unsuitable for advertisers. I can't think of a single video I've ever uploaded that you look at YouTube's actual guidelines is actually unsuitable for advertisers. I try to keep my content fairly clean. I try to stay fairly neutral in the topics that I cover. I try not to cover overly controversial things or make major political statements or anything like that. Not just because I want to be advertiser friendly. In fact, that's a fairly small piece of it, but rather just because I want to stay engaging with my audience and I don't really want to turn anybody off from this. That's not who I am. I'm not here to try and foist my opinion on you. In fact, the entire point behind these podcast episodes is to simply get people to think critically. I'm fine with you disagreeing with me. If you think I'm full of shit, go ahead, leave a message down in the comments. People do it all the time. You wouldn't be the only one. But as long as you're nice about it and explain to me why you think I'm wrong or why your opinion differs, I'm totally cool with that. I'm just here to foster opinion. But even then, with all the dancing around some of this really sensitive stuff that I try to do, the machine learning still caught me for several months. Every single episode got flagged. A lot of other content creators got hit by that too. There is just no way for these platforms to be able to keep up with knocking down the worst of the worst, the ones that are actually trying to incite harm, that are actually promoting violence and hate, however you want to define any of that kind of stuff. So there's that whole content moderation angle to it. It's just really, really difficult for these platforms to do it simply because of the scale. The other thing, and this is where we start to get into a bit of an ethical kind of gray area on the part of these platforms, is due to their business model. You look at the way those platforms work, and like I said at the top of the podcast, it's all about interaction. It's all about getting eyeballs on these platforms, getting engagement, getting people involved. The more people that use the platform, one, the more data that can be gleaned off of them that can be sold, but also the more ads that can be run, especially ads targeted to those users based off of the data that's being generated off of them. I mean, this is how Facebook and Google, YouTube, a bunch of other platforms actually make their money, is you are the product. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts. So if you overly moderate your content, you're going to be cutting down on the total number of users on your platform and potentially turning off others, because that's not, what's left is not necessarily what they're interested in, rightly or wrongly. And I think Twitter is actually the worst offender in this regard. Twitter absolutely sucks at content moderation, and a former CEO of Twitter has even admitted as such. I think he even used the word sucks. He said something like, we suck at, content moderation, and we've always sucked at it. Here's the thing though, while Twitter may say it wants to try and clean up its act, it wants to try and clean up the platform, because there are a lot of people out there who hate on Twitter because of all the hate and just bad interactions that they get off of it. People behave badly on Twitter. Not to say they don't behave badly elsewhere. I think Facebook is probably just as bad, but that's a different topic. But, as much as Twitter says it's trying to work on things, I have a really tough time believing it, because there are still plenty of people on Twitter who should have gotten banned a long time ago. And without naming names, there are some fairly prominent people in society today who are in the news literally every day, who use Twitter as a big platform, who, based on the terms and conditions that they agreed to, they should have gotten banned. But Twitter keeps dancing around enforcing that. They keep kind of bending the rules, stretching the rules, reinterpreting their own terms and conditions in order to accommodate those highly vocal users, because they bring in revenue. You cut out a lot of those people that get people worked up, that get people riled up. Even if the majority of the platform hates on those people because of what they say and do and the opinions they're trying to express, it still drives engagement. It still drives interaction, and it still ultimately makes these platforms money. Especially Twitter, which last I checked, they're still kind of hurting for revenue. They still haven't quite figured out how to become really, really profitable. So, why would they cut out a chunk of their revenue like that? That's a big challenge to it. So, really sad to say, I think dealing with a lot of the hate that we see online, a lot of the harmful content that we see online, a lot of not necessarily differing opinions, because differing opinions is good. And I maybe should have said this several times through the podcast, because sometimes people tend to tune out. Maybe they push the tab to the background and do other stuff while they're listening to me and miss out on important bits and pieces and start railing on me down in the comments on stuff that I didn't say or express at all because they missed like a disclaimer that I put in front of it or whatever. But, I think differing opinions is really, really good. But there is always going to be a group of people who have opinions, who have ideas, who are advocating certain ideologies that the vast majority of society is going to think is wrong. So how do you deal with understanding who is the vocal minority who has bad intentions and who isn't, who's actually trying to give you real legitimate information versus those who are trying to give you the so-called fake news? Well, I don't think the platforms are going to help us with this. I don't think that there's really going to be any sort of systematic solution to dealing with this. It's all going to come down to us. And I think it comes down to the simple concepts of critical thinking and skepticism, both of which I think are sorely lacking, especially when it comes to social media, but life in general as well. And it kind of comes back to that whole so-called liberal media, liberal news kind of angle that people love to trash talk. It's not the political angle part of it. It's just about questioning what you're being told and wanting to seek out the truth, seeking out more opinions, more information, trying to find the hard facts and figures and numbers to actually know really what's going on, and not just accepting things that are being given to you at face value. That's incredibly hard to do. And it's partially the reason why news outlets and media organizations exist. There is no possible way that the average person could go out and independently verify every piece of information that's being given to them. So established media organizations have to fill in that role. And yeah, they've dropped the ball. They've dropped the ball several times, many times. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they're all bad. However, at the same time, if something seems fishy, if something doesn't quite make sense, if something seems overly fantastical to you when you're reading that news, it probably is. It's probably not true. So the best advice that I can offer is do your own research. Maybe not necessarily go and try to dig deep and get the actual facts and figures yourself. But if you read a piece of news, don't just read it, internalize it, believe it to be true and move on. If something doesn't quite seem right, maybe try and find another source of news to see if that kind of corroborates that same information or not. Preferably another organization that's done its own research and isn't simply trying to regurgitate what that one source you already read or saw was expressing. And this is the classic example of problems with like professional blogs. Not to say that they're all bad, but the race to publish faster and faster has led some of these organizations to simply copy each other. Well, if the first person to publish got it wrong and everybody else is copying off of them, suddenly everybody's got it wrong. So again, grain of salt, just try to do your own research. Try to find some other places that strive to tell the objective truth and see if what they're saying jives with what you've read or seen or have been told. Ultimately, I still think the internet and social media have done way more good than harm, because it's democratized content. It's gotten so many more just amazing ideas out there, many more stories to be told. It's enriched society in many, many ways. But, you know, there's still always going to be some bad apples out there, and you are really on your own to try and find them and shut them out. Anyway, this was a very long podcast episode. Hopefully you're still with me. I am curious as to your thoughts. This is something that's been on my mind for a while, and it seems like it's been like a drumbeat that's been getting louder and louder and louder as the impacts of fake news and malicious activity and harmful ideas has continued to spread and gotten bigger, right? It's had a bigger and bigger impact on a lot of our lives. I think it's something that we need to just take another look at and kind of reset, and not just necessarily continue to go at things the way we always have. It's really up to us. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on this. Do you agree with me? Do you not agree with me? It's fine if you don't agree with me. I'm just asking that you kind of be nice about it when you tell me you don't agree with me. If you're just going to sit there and talk trash and call me names, you know, that's not helping anything and actually kind of serves a point, right? So let me know what you think down in the comments. Also, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available as plain MP3 downloads for supporters on my Patreon page. As little as $1 a month gets you access to them. They usually go up a few days before the episodes show up on YouTube, and there's private RSS feed support. Throw it into the podcast player of your choice. It gets automatically delivered when I upload. It's totally awesome for you, and it helps support the channel, so it's just something I ask you consider. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.